Why does it seem like some dyads of leaders, some groups of leaders, just for some reason hit it off, despite the fact that they might represent states that are very much in poor relations or might even be enemies with one another? Yet at a human level, they're able to connect and sort of create a bond between them. And then why is it that some of those bonds are able to scale up to the state level and other bonds are not, right? So international relations kind of downplays the practice of diplomacy, specifically face-to-face diplomacy, and yet practitioners of politics, the people who actually do international relations, say it's very important, right? I'm very much concerned that one of the things we've seen in the international system is actually a lack of content, right? So you take all of a sudden, overnight, or even quicker than that, U.S. policy, U.S. interests will change at some level in certain areas, because right? He didn't have that same relationship with Gorbachev. He doesn't have that trust immediately because the trust is the personal side, right? It's the interpersonal. So Reagan had it. Bush comes in, same party, same everything, but because he doesn't have that bond, he kind of wants to take a step back and see for himself, right? So I think again, that's a moment of the transition where it's sort of like, these bonds are really kind of crucial, and I think leaders often want to establish their own understanding of somebody else, and not just taking the perspective of somebody else for a few minutes can change the way that you understand what their problems are. It can lowers levels of prejudice. It makes you kind of better equipped to understand what they're going through, and that has an effect that will last over time. So in diplomacy and face-to-face interactions, when you have that ability to see the other side, you're very much in a sort of situation where both brains, and this sounds kind of strange, but both brains are doing the same thing at once, which makes a connection between the two and sort of supports the idea that people talk about like we're on the same wavelength, right? It's probably the core issue of bringing in psychology is how you get from the individual level to the state level. Like, how do you
Right.
bridge that gap? Um,
I'm very pleased to have today's guest, Professor Dr. Marcus Holmes. He is a professor of government and department chair at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. He's also a co-director of the Social Science Research Method Center, which houses the Political Psychology and International Relations Lab, which he directs. It's very good to see you, Marcus. Welcome. Thank
Thank
you
you
so
so
much
much.
for your time.
Very nice to see you as well. I look forward to our conversation. It's been a while. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Right, right. Well, I'd like to also mention that Marcus is the author of a very influential book, Face-to-Face Diplomacy, Social Neuroscience, and International Relations, which was published, I guess, in 2018 by
Mm-hmm.
Cambridge University Press. And he has a very special place in diplomatic studies, bringing political psychology, neuroscience, sociology into the understanding of diplomacy. I would be very much interested in having discussion with Marcus on relations between political psychology, neuroscience, diplomacy, and international relations.
Mm-hmm.
Let me start from just asking you, what projects are you working on now? If I may ask you, please.
Right. Well, I always have a lot of projects going on. So I'll tell you about a couple of what I consider to be sort of the big, kind of most exciting ones.
Right.
The first one is actually a project that I've been working with Nicholas Wheeler at the University of Birmingham, who is a leader in trust and international relations, and has really gotten into this question of why it is that some leaders are able to trust one another. His 2018 book, Trusting Enemies, basically tried to argue that under certain conditions, leaders can come together and they find that through different processes of humanization and sort of reflection of what the other side is going through, they're able to get to a point where they develop a trusting relationship with
Mhm.
the other side. So what Nick and I are trying to do in this book that we're writing right now is kind of look at the really hard question of why does it seem like some dyads of leaders, some groups of leaders, just for some reason hit it off, despite the fact that they might represent states that are very much in poor relations or might even be enemies with one another. Yet at a human level, they're able to connect and sort of create a bond between them. And then why is it that some of those bonds are able to scale up to the state level and other other bonds are not, right? So we have instances where, leaders will get together and they say, "Hey, I like this person. I think I can trust them." Maybe they bond, but for whatever reason they can't really do anything with that bond because it's very difficult to get the machinery of the bureaucracy or the military or, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or whatever the roadblock is to kind of get on board with the idea that we can trust the other side. So Nick and I are trying to tackle those two big questions. Why is it sometimes these leaders get along, and then why is it sometimes that they're able to kind of aggregate that trust or social bond that they have with one another upwards. So we're almost done. We have a contract with Oxford University Press. So my hope is that this book will be out sometime next year, and so that's going to be our sort of main kind of contribution to this literature, trying to tackle those two big problems. The other sort of area of interest for me comes directly out of the pandemic, and it's sort of what role these digital technologies have in diplomacy. So right now we're recording this on Zoom. Zoom is a nice technology. It allows us to connect even though we're thousands of miles away. The quality is
Right.
pretty good. I can see your facial expressions. I can see how you're responding to what I'm talking about. But there's also something I think that most of us feel when we're on Zoom, that it's just not the same as being in person, right? I
Mm.
think we all would agree with that. And some of the reasons are obvious. I can't shake your hand. I don't know what it smells like in the room that you're in. I don't know what's going on below your chest because we're only sort of head up. You might be fidgeting underneath the table, giving me insights into that you're nervous or something like that, but I don't see any of that on here, right? So one of the projects that I'm looking at with a co-author of mine, Jeff Kaplow here at William and Mary, is trying to figure out what precisely it is about Zoom or other types of technologies like this that don't fully capture the face-to-face experience, and are there other technologies that actually might be able to do that somewhat better? So, for example, virtual reality in 10 years ago was very sort of underdeveloped and was very
Mhm.
clunky. But now, if you've seen those sort of Apple Vision Pro devices, they're becoming much more sophisticated, much more usable. They're not as uncomfortable as they once were. So we're quickly approaching, I think, a point where it's possible that diplomats or maybe even leaders at some point might be using virtual reality technology to have meetings like we're having. And the nice thing about that technology is that the promise of it, now it's still a promise, they have to develop this, but the promise is it might be able to replicate some of the things that face-to-face physical encounters are able to do that Zoom does not. So, for example, if it gives you a better sense of what it's like to be in the room with the other person, might even give you the ability to touch the person virtually by shaking their hand or giving them a hug or something like that. I think there's a lot of interesting sort of things that are going on with virtual reality that we don't quite understand and don't quite appreciate. And so one of my projects is looking at, sort of comparing Zoom interactions with these
Mm.
virtual reality interactions. So those are two kind of projects that spring to mind. But I always have lots of different. I guess I'll add one last thing in there, which is I've become increasingly interested in sports diplomacy,
Oh.
and specifically thinking about the mechanisms by which sports diplomacy actually work. We had a project this past summer at William and Mary where we took a group of little kids, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds from Williamsburg to Japan, and they played baseball games with their Japanese counterparts for a week and a half. And we're interviewing the kids and we're sort of measuring different things to try to get at what is it about the playing of sports? What is it about that type of people to people exchange that allows relationships to be built? And then how do you scale those relationships up to the state level, right? Because this is always the trick, which is you get individuals in a room together or on a playing field or whatever, you might be able to engender some type of good relationship, but then scaling it up is always tricky. So I've become very interested in what role sports diplomacy specifically plays in kind of managing these relationships and what we can learn from sports diplomacy in terms of lessons and apply that to other areas of diplomacy as well. So I guess I have three kind of main topics at the moment.
Well, fascinating. It's It's a very impressive and a very pioneering approach. But let me go to some bigger question, bigger issue. So, bringing together this human dimension, real people with the gestures, face expressions, neuro attributes on the one hand, but on the other hand, holds this political sphere area. So, how does working across psychology, neuroscience, and sociology improve our understanding of diplomacy and its real world impact? So, what would it bring us? So,
Hmm. Right,
some
that's good.
little bigger picture.
Yeah. So the question that really sort of motivates most of my research and thinking about face-to-face diplomacy is this basic one, which is why does it happen? Why do diplomats need to go and see one another? Why do leaders seek each other out? Because if you think about it, it's actually somewhat counterintuitive, right? Because it's costly, right? You have to travel, it takes time. Presidents, heads of state, they have lots of things going on. And so you might say, well, if you can just communicate via a letter or you could communicate over the telephone or Zoom or something like that, then that should be good enough. Like, why is it that you need to spend all this time and energy, pursuing this? There actually are examples of, leaders putting their lives on the line, right? So we have examples of diplomacy in, sort of war settings, of course.
Right.
But FDR traveling to the Yalta conference, for example, was in very poor
Yes.
health, and he
Mm.
was he was really sick, and he made that trek, halfway
Mm.
around the world essentially, to go have the Yalta conference, with Stalin, right? So the question
Right.
is, well, why do all this, right? And it's particularly puzzling when a lot of existing theories in international relations kind of downplay the role of diplomacy because they would say, there are bigger things going on in the world than individuals, right? We have nuclear weapons, we have how much power a state has, we have the interests that states have, all these kind of material things. You have the economy. There's lots of different variables that affect international relations. Individuals are very low on the list. And so I
Right.
think
Right.
a lot of international relations scholars would say that, individuals are sort of just kind of along for the ride on what's happening, and they don't have a lot of agency to be able to change things. Um, but if you talk to diplomats or you talk to leaders, they completely disagree with that assessment. They say, "Of course we do. We have a
Yes.
lot of agency, right?" And
Right.
so it's puzzling that international relations kind of downplays the practice of diplomacy, specifically face-to-face diplomacy, and yet practitioners of politics, the people who actually do international relations, say it's very important, right? So I started all this thinking, well, both of those can't be true at the same time, right? It's either the diplomats and the leaders are right, or the political scientists and the international relations scholars are right, but both can't be right because they're hitting up against each other, right? They're mutually exclusive. So I think the value of thinking about it in terms of what face-to-face interactions are actually all about helps us to somewhat get at that puzzle, right? And so the upshot for a lot of my work is we leaders engage in this and diplomats engage in this not because they're naive or because they're stupid or because they just have these grand visions of being like a big person in international politics. They do it because it's actually useful to them, and specifically it's useful to them, I would argue, in that it gives you a better understanding of the intentions of the other side, right? So when
Mm.
you're meeting with somebody face to face, you're better able to pick up on the very subtle, micro expressions that are going on in somebody's face. You're able to pick up on the mannerisms. You're able to pick up on the emotion of a person's face, how excited they are, how energetic they are, how threatening they seem to be, how trustworthy they seem to be. And all of that information is available to you in the face-to-face encounter. That's not available other ways, right? It's very difficult to do that in a letter. It's very difficult to do that in a cable wire, or even a telephone call, right? And it might even actually be difficult to do on Zoom, right? So the reason they do it is because they think that it's useful and they're getting actually good information from those meetings. Now, it doesn't mean that they're always right, right? I mean, it's certainly the case that in social life, people deceive one another and people lie. But even in those settings and face-to-face interactions, you're often able to pick up on some clues that are available to you that would not be available to you otherwise, because you're getting information from their body and their face and so on and so forth. So I think the value of bringing, let's say, psychology in, or neuroscience, or even sociology, is that it does kind of help to make sense of this puzzle, because
Mhm.
without it, it's very difficult to say, well, why are leaders engaging in face-to-face interactions? You might just say, well, they think it's useful, but that's not all that satisfying. You want to know kind of, well, why do they think it's useful? And then actually, is it useful? And I think that's where the psychology and the neuroscience and the sociology kind of help us, because our theories in political science and international relations just are not, they're ill-equipped to deal with this problem. I'll give you a specific example. At the end of the Cold War, a lot of international relations theories and scholars were quite surprised because they didn't see it coming, right? The Berlin Wall falls down, Soviet Union essentially collapses, and almost overnight the Cold War was over. Whereas if you had asked people, scholars of international politics, before the Cold War was over, they would have said, no, this is going to keep on going. Soviet Union has nuclear weapons, the United States has nuclear weapons, and they have a strong military, we have a strong military, the balance of power is just going to continue. And yet somehow that was completely wrong, and that did not happen. And so the question is, so why? And so I think international relations scholars were left kind of in this position where their existing theories didn't have a lot of purchase or analytical leverage to kind of explain what happened. And so we were searching for other things that might help. And so that's kind of why I then started to think about, well, what was going on at the time when the Cold War ended? Well, you did have, these heads of state and Gorbachev and Reagan interacting. What was happening in those meetings? Well, in retrospect, it looks like they were actually getting understanding of one another's intentions better than they had previously. They were starting to trust one another. And so it wasn't the only end of the reason the Cold War ended, of course, but it was one of the things that I think made the Cold War end the way that it did, peacefully. And that was because they were able to sort out their differences effectively in a face-to-face setting. So the bottom line, I think, is, oftentimes in international relations, we have, very good theories to explain state behavior. I think a lot of our theories, do a good job from both an explanatory and sometimes even a predictive way. But there's a lot of things going on in social life and political life that are not captured by our existing theories. And I think that's when branching out to these other disciplines can really be quite valuable.
Oh, very interesting. But at the same time, we know that in diplomacy, there are so many rituals, ceremonies. People just do things quite mechanically. So, how could we distinguish real, genuine face to face diplomacy, meaningful, from these kinds of more ritualistic interaction?
Yeah,
So,
it's a great question. So one thing I want to point out is, and I want to give a shout out to one of our postdocs here at William and Mary, really good scholar, Min Sun Ku. KU is her last name. She's working on, she finished a dissertation and now is converting it into a book, looking at one aspect of what you're talking about, which is sort of the ritualized nature of diplomacy. And specifically, she's interested in the high level summits, right? One of the criticisms, of course, of summitry in particular, is that it's sort of, meaningless photo ops. A lot of the reasons leaders do it is because they like to have the press conference and they like to say we got a deal. You think about, the Trump and Kim summits, with the North Koreans, and it was sort of, you get the impression that it was more about the show than it was the actual substance, right? And so one criticism a lot of people make of summits is that it's basically pro forma. Everything that's important has been decided earlier at like lower levels of analysis. All the work gets done between rank and file diplomats and working groups and all that kind of stuff. The leaders are really just there for the picture, and the sort of ceremony. And what she argues is actually even the ritualized aspect, the ceremony, does have an effect, not necessarily at the leader level, but at the audience level, right? So if you think about people watching a summit, what they're doing is they're essentially playing out international politics. Like this is this
right.
is this is what they know of international politics is they see the summit. And I think in her argument, it would be something like, that's sort of reassuring. That kind of stabilizes the international system. It provides sort of like a level of a comfortable blanket that you can put on because, this is how international politics works. And I know what I'm supposed to see, and I'm seeing it. And it makes you feel just a little bit more comfortable. So when, Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin were having, summits before the war in Ukraine, yeah, you didn't like the topic and the prospect of war, but there was something about the summit itself that was a little bit reassuring. You have these people talking, and this is very similar to what we've seen in the past, and it gives you sort of continuity. So I think there is an argument to be made that summits and these leader visits are actually really important at the sort of audience level because they can kind of create expectations and stable expectations about international politics. The way that I think about this, though, is even the ritualized ones, even the ones that are sort of just you're going through the motions, you're doing it, just because you have to. That's a form of contact that I do think is valuable, right? So one of
Mm,
one of the concerns that I have in thinking about, we're recording this in December of 2024. I'm very much concerned that one of the things we've seen in the international system is actually a lack of content, right? So you take the United States-China relationships, right? I think a lot of people would argue that that's a poor relationship at the moment. There's not a lot of trust between the two countries. There's not a lot of intention understanding. You get these situations where you're sort of rife for misperception. People worry about, something happening in the South China Sea where there's misperception. We can get into war. When you saw those balloons over Canada and the United States, there was concern about what those were. The United States evidently tried to reach out and had trouble even contacting, some of the officials in China to understand what's going on. So to me, we're in a situation where there's a lack of contact, a lack of sustained contact, and one of the things that brings, I think, is the greater potential for something to go wrong. So I would rather see, ritualized, rote interactions that are occurring where very little substance is actually happening, because if nothing else, you get that human to human contact and that human to human understanding. It scares me that we don't see more contact between the United
mm,
States and Japan and China. By the way, this also happens at the sort of popular level as well. There was a story in the New York Times recently how study abroad numbers, so the number of students from China going to the United States and the number of students from the U.S. going to China, have plummeted. So if you take seriously the idea that people to people exchanges can be beneficial in developing relations between countries, that's a really bad thing. That's a bad sort of situation that we find ourselves in. So I'm concerned about that. The last thing I'll say is from a methodological perspective, I think maybe one of the things that you're hinting at too is that this can be very difficult in the sense that oftentimes when I speak with diplomats, and this makes a lot of sense, they would argue that the work that they do every day is absolutely crucial, right? Because they're saying, I work in NATO, I work at the World Trade Organization, I work in this organization, and this is how international politics gets done, right? It's the everyday, it's the routine,
right.
it's the quotidian, right? And I think oftentimes they're right in the sense that those building blocks are the things upon which the higher level, relations are built. So I don't discount that at all. But you're also right that a lot of the meetings that if you start to inquire a little bit, you ask them like, what happened in that meeting? Turns out not a whole lot of substance necessarily, right? In other words, the value of diplomacy might be as much in just being there in the room and just having the interaction and less about the actual meetings and the substance of what gets, sort of transferred back and forth. So methodologically, you have to try to figure out which is it. I mean, is this beneficial because of what was transmitted between the two and the deal that they got, or is this beneficial just because it happened and the fact that they were there and they were able to, have this interaction? All else being equal, I'm a fan of more interaction, and I think that we need more institutions that allow the
Right.
facilitation of people to interact with one another.
I absolutely fully agree with you. Uh, but if we look at, let's say, conferences like Vienna Congress in 1815, we may see very intensive uh, interpersonal interactions between high-level diplomats for months. But now trend is that diplomats are seeing more and more each other through these digital devices. what we may expect in the future, what would be with the face-to-face diplomacy when we have even more developed technology.
Yeah, I think I don't expect face-to-face interactions and diplomacy to ever go away fully because I think leaders and diplomats do appreciate a lot of the logic about what we've been talking about so far, right? They understand that it's beneficial and they would like to continue to engage in it. But I agree that when you have these technologies that make communication so much more inexpensive and quick, and you don't have to hop on a plane, and you can just have a meeting in 30 minutes, there's a intuitive kind of nature to that that says maybe we should just do that, right? Maybe we should just do this meeting. I mean, one real problem with that model of diplomacy, though, is that it very much limits the kind of serendipitous encounter. If you speak with
Mm,
diplomats, for example, the United Nations, one of the things that you hear a lot is that the work often does not get done in sort of scheduled meetings, where you have a Zoom link and you have an hour on the calendar and you're going to have an interaction, but rather it gets done in the line at Starbucks or over lunch. And it's because you're seeing somebody that you didn't expect to see, but it something in your brain recognizes, oh, this person actually might be the one I need to be talking about, or this person might have an idea about this problem that we're gonna solve, right? The Zoom sort of scheduled interaction is great for when we know sort of the parameters of what we're trying to accomplish. We have information that we need to share, and if it's mostly about sharing information, it's fine. But if we have an ill-structured problem, we really don't know how to solve it. We need creativity. We need to bring in people that we might not even think about until we see them. That's the value that you really lose when you have this sort of interaction go virtual. I think the other thing too is that Zoom is really in video conferencing is like the best of these technologies. A lot of what's been written in the last few years is that more and more diplomacy is actually taking place through the phone, through WhatsApp messaging, text messaging, and so that's a very sort of like lower level of information exchange, right? Because you're not even getting the facial expressions, you're not getting anything, right? And there's some evidence, there's been some work that's looked at the ability to create interpersonal relationships over text messaging and WhatsApp messaging in particular. And that research suggests that it's possible specifically to maintain relationships, but very difficult to build them in the first place. So if you're a diplomat working at the United Nations, let's say, and you have to, interact with somebody that you've worked with for 10 years and you had a good relationship, WhatsApp is fine. You can communicate that way. And I think all of us have experienced this in our personal lives. Text messaging for people that you know and you're friendly with is fine,
mm,
right? But it's much harder to develop a relationship with somebody who you haven't met before, haven't spent a lot of time with before through the text messaging platforms, right? So we're seeing, I think, even an increase in that sort of technology, well, which I think is not great. The point that you made about Vienna, and this is something that I think about a lot, because I agree that we need almost some sort of new Congress type system, which would allow us. And there's other people, Charlie Kupchan has made this argument before. Other people have made a similar argument, which is the problem in the international system at the moment is that we've sort of divided, much like the Cold War, kind of into these different camps. You got Russia and North Korea. You have China. Then you have the NATO countries, Western Europe. You got the global South, and when you're set up like that and not interacting, you get all the problems that we were alluding to before, right? You get the problems of misunderstanding, the problems of accidents happening, the problems of sort of the growing distrust between countries. The real question, though, is how do you design an institution or a Congress that facilitates the interaction, and then, frankly, how do you convince every country that's going to be relevant to actually join it in good faith? I think one of the problems that diplomacy has just generally is that sometimes countries view diplomacy as a type of leverage, right? So it's like if I'm China, I don't want to join your institution that the Biden administration or the Trump administration created. Especially, I don't want to do that for free. It's like what am I going to get out of it, right? So it's this sort of quid pro quo. It's like what am I going to get in exchange for joining this? And then oftentimes the view is if I do join it, it's not necessarily showing weakness, but it's showing something that suggests that there's a reason why we do need to join. In other words, they might be indicating or signaling we recognize, that we might be part of the problem. And by joining this institution, we're kind of saying, yeah, we're part of the problem. So they don't want to do that. They don't want to signal that they're part of the problem. So the real question for me is when we talk about this is how do you design the institution so it works effectively, but then how do you get the membership to be the countries that you want to be in it? The Biden administration a few years ago, I don't know if you remember this, talked about this what was it? It wasn't a Congress, but it was like a League of Democracies or something like that. It was going to be like all the democracies in the world were going to come together. But that doesn't solve the problem. It's the non-democracies that you need to be bringing into. You're right, So, but it's just very difficult to do that. And the last thing I'll say too is these developments that often take place, which I think are very good. So, for example, the trilateral summit that the United States had with South Korea and Japan, the Biden administration, brought these leaders to Camp David. I think that's good because it reaffirms, the U.S. alliance. It shows partners in the Asia Pacific that we're serious about this. We're going to balance against China. But the problem, of course, is that for everything you do to sort of reinforce your relationship with the allies, you're also making China more nervous, right? So we need to figure out a way, I think, to be able to reassure allies at the same time that we're not, sort of, creating more insecurity problems for China, right? So in other words, we need to be able to reassure both in a sense, right? Our allies, Japan and South Korea and others, we're going to stand by you, Taiwan, we're going to stand by you. But at the same time, we want to convey to China, you don't have to worry about us. We're approaching this from a defensive perspective. We're going to try to have a good relationship. We want to have a good relationship with you. Let's try to do some confidence building measures to increase the trust between the two countries. I think you can do both of those things at the same time, but it's a delicate balance and it's a very tricky problem for diplomacy because you're trying to pull off something where you're reassuring one group while also trying to reassure the other. That's very difficult, But I think your idea of creating a Congress or something like it would help tremendously.
Uh, yeah. Coming back to digital diplomacy, I know you published quite a few works on digital diplomacy, and mm, does digital diplomacy weaken or support human connection in diplomacy? So how could we see this process?
Yeah, I mean, so my take on digital diplomacy is that it's both about sort of the state trying to project, or an international organization, or whoever is doing the diplomacy part, because really anybody can participate in diplomacy. Like that's one of the things that I think as a field we sort of recognize more over time. It used to be states do diplomacy, everybody else is doing something else, but it's not diplomacy. I think we now kind of recognize everybody can kind of participate in diplomacy. So when you're doing digital diplomacy, it's both about sort of projecting a particular type of image that you want to portray about yourself, right? So if you think about Ukraine's Twitter account in the early days of the war, and you go back and look at some of those tweets, it was about projecting strength. It was about saying like we're gonna stand up for ourselves. We're not gonna allow this to happen. We're not gonna allow Putin to do this. We're gonna be strong. And they were doing that, I think, because they wanted to show strength in the international system. It's one way to sort of project a level of resolve or a level of strength, right? So you're sending out into the world this image of yourself that you want others to adopt or accept. But at the same time, what you're also interested in is seeing how the audience responds to that. So you can think about it like countries are kind of on a stage. This is drawing from the Irving Goffman kind of perspective. States are on a stage. They're actors. They're projecting out to the audience. They're doing the best job that they can to convey a particular impression. But the audience, they have agency in the process. They don't have to accept it. They can say, this is terrible. I don't buy it. So some people did that. They saw Ukraine saying, we're strong, and they're like, nope, they're not strong at all. They're going to get taken over, and it's going to be bad. Or others will say, no, I accept that, and that is Ukraine, and I stand with Ukraine, and I'm gonna try to, do as much as I can to support them, at least digitally or whatever. So I think part of it is also like looking at how the audience responds and then making tweaks or changes based on that response. So just like an actor on a stage, if he's doing a monologue and he looks over and he sees somebody in the front row, they're yawning, or they look bored or whatever, he or she might up the energy, might change a little bit, right? I think states are basically doing the same thing with digital diplomacy. So I see it as a way for states to convey an image, see how that image is received, and then make changes to that image in subsequent
Yeah.
rounds of interaction. The other way that I see digital diplomacy is very similar to Min Sun Ku's work, where I talked about summits. This is an area where everyday people get to experience international politics. So if you're in Virginia and you have a Twitter account and you saw, the Ukrainian foreign ministry like tweeting about the war, you're participating in international politics at that level, because that country, Ukraine, comes to life when you see
Right,
that
right,
tweet, right?
right.
The war comes to life, when you see images on TV and all that, of course, but when you see the tweets and you see the actual people in Ukraine sitting down at a computer or phone and sending out this message, that's very real and visceral, and so
Yeah,
that's an area where people, everyday people, kind of engage in international politics in a
yeah.
sense. And the
How,
fact that they can retweet or they can comment or whatever allows them to participate in that process. It doesn't mean Ukraine is necessarily paying attention to every single retweet, but they're judging sort of what their tweets are doing, and they're paying attention to how things are being received.
yeah, but again, about human relations between diplomats. Do you think digital diplomacy helped in this respect to support human relations, or it weakens it?
Hmm. I think it's a tough question to answer, because part of the problem is understanding how the digital diplomacy is used, right? So I think sometimes, if you just take leaders for example, right? Leaders might have, behind closed doors, decent relationships with others, right? So the head of
Right.
state, likes another head of state, that's fine. But on the front stage, when they're in front of public, they feel a need to do a lot of projection of strength, right? We saw this in the first Trump administration, right? He was big on Twitter. Remember with Kim, it was my button is bigger than your button, and all this kind of stuff, right? Surely you would make the argument, I would think, that probably doesn't help the relationship between the two of them. But what's interesting is, if you go back and look at what was happening behind closed doors, there were these letters that were being sent, right?
Mm,
So publicly, Trump is very much sort of making bold statements, showing resolve. Kim, to a certain extent, was doing the same thing. Behind closed doors, things were different, and they were having interactions at different levels. So I think it can be one of these things where it can be used to um, hurt a relationship, but we
mm,
always have to keep in mind that there is this public private differentiation, and sometimes we make the mistake of thinking, just because we see what's happening with our eyes in public, that necessarily explains everything about what's going on behind the scenes as well. And I don't think that's always true. The
mm,
last the last sort of example I'll use here is not in the digital space, but it's back in the Cold War. If you go back and look at what Reagan, for example, was saying about the Soviet Union, I mean, evil empire, tear down this wall, like all of this sort of very strong public resolve and show of strength. And then when they're interacting in a summit behind closed doors where no one's watching, it's incredibly different, right? So I look
right.
at digital diplomacy similarly, right? It can be used to support relationships. You can affirm
Yeah,
your understanding or relationship with somebody, but it can also be something where you're at least
right.
publicly going the other way, and then privately maybe things are a little bit different.
Very good point. Yes.
Yeah.
About personal bonds between diplomats, you published quite a few papers on that. This is very important, of course, but on the other hand, we understand that diplomats are representing
Mhm.
political entities. So, on the one hand, the importance of personal bonds, human relations, but on the other hand, political interests, which might be very controversial, very conflictual. So, how these two things could get together, balance each other?
Yeah, no, this is a challenge. I mean, I think anybody who studies diplomacy at the interpersonal level kind of runs into this problem, which is you have interpersonal relations which are, deeply personal, right? Deeply human. Gorbachev talked about the human factor, like the ability to humanize the other person and get along and all that kind of stuff. But that's happening at a level of the individual, which seems very different than
Yeah.
the interests of the state. And sometimes, these things can change overnight, right? So we have an incoming Trump administration on January 20th who get, inaugurated. All of a sudden, overnight, or even quicker than that, US policy, US interests will change at some level in certain areas, right? So if you're a diplomat who's been working, career foreign service officer, you've seen many administrations come and go, your relationships with others will stay. You will have those personal bonds. You will trust the other person. You'll have that level of empathy. But almost immediately, the interests that you're trying to pursue might very well be different. So I think it's a very interesting, sort of like sociological problem where you have these sort of two things happening at the same time: the development of a bond and the development of a personal connection, when the things that are outside of that personal bond can change. So the hope is that that bond is strong enough so that when things do change, they're understood and they're respected in the way that they're supposed to be intended, and in good faith, right? So in other words, if we're working together and we've worked together for 10 years, you know me, I know you, new administration comes in and says, "Hey, you got to stop doing XYZ." You're not going to like that, but you at least know when I'm saying that, I'm coming from a place of good faith, and it's just the orders that I've been given, or it's the interests that are above me. So I think that the bond can help smooth over sometimes some of these transitions, because you know that at least that the person is doing it in a way that they're trying to just do their job, and they're trying to be, get through this as easily as possible. Versus if it was somebody coming from somebody that you had just met and had no bond with and didn't understand where they were coming from, that could be very abrupt and very traumatic. So I think in
Yeah.
cases of transition, that the bond actually does remain quite important. The last thing I'll say, and I keep on going back to the Cold War because it's one of my favorite examples. We saw this when the George Herbert Walker Bush administration came in. So Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev had these summits, and they got these agreements, INF Treaty, and all that. And then Bush comes in and says, I'm gonna kind of put the brakes on this just a little bit, right? Because I wanna sort of reassess things. As people talked about, it's like the Bush pause. They want to kind of reassess foreign policy. They want to reassess the relationship with the Soviet Union, and just kind of take their own stock of it, right? And so one of the things that's interesting, though, is that he does that despite being the same political party, despite being Reagan's vice president. So you would think that they'd all be on the same page, but it was because, I argue, and others have pointed this out, because he didn't have that same relationship with Gorbachev. He doesn't have that trust immediately, because the trust is the personal side, right? It's the interpersonal. So Reagan had it. Bush comes in, same party, same everything, but because he doesn't have that bond, he kind of wants to take a step back and see for himself, right? So I think, again, that's a moment of the transition where it's sort of like, these bonds are really kind of crucial, and I think leaders often want to establish their own understanding of somebody else and not just take it for granted that because
Mm.
Reagan liked this guy and trusted him, that I automatically will as well.
Yeah, very interesting. I also saw when representatives, ambassadors of conflicting states
Mhm.
blaming each other at official level, at conferences. But after the conference, they've been quite friendly.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's very difficult to combine these personal relations and your official position.
That's
So
right.
they are kind of two areas which sometimes cannot come together. So you have to play two games. So from this perspective, I could perhaps compare this human and political element like figure and ground. When
Mm.
you put personal, person to person relation as a figure, so in a ground you will have a political sphere. When you put political things as a figure, so you would see as a ground interpersonal relations, but you cannot see both together. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, no, I've definitely spoken to diplomats who have said similar things. They'll say things like, publicly, I have to portray the state interest, right? And I have to be difficult in this press conference or this memo or whatever it is. And yet, interpersonally, like I really like this person, and
Right.
it's like we get along and we drink
Yeah.
together, we have dinner, and so my take on that is always, sort of that's actually fine. Like I think that all else
Mm.
being equal, I would rather have a situation where they don't get along publicly and they have these state interests, but get along personally, than don't get along publicly and also don't get along personally, right? Because then if you're in a situation where you do need to resolve something and you're in a moment where there requires some type of trust on the other side, having that relationship is really valuable, right? So oftentimes that sort of like private public dimension is different. But if I at least have the ability to trust this person, then it might be very beneficial to me down the road when I have to use it. Like I kind of have to use that interpersonal relationship to get something, even if it's just the meaning of a particular sentence in a document or changing a word. You want to know that that person is approaching that from good faith and they're not trying to mess with you or anything like that. Despite the fact that publicly we have to do this.
Right.
And the other thing too is, even if there are states of enmity, between, two different groups, or, you have a situation where publicly things are really bad, it's very easy to sort of assume, if you're not having interaction with the other side, that they're the problem, right? So to use the
Mm.
Cold War example again, one of the things that Ronald Reagan didn't appreciate originally was that the Soviet Union thought that it was possible that one day the United States might use nuclear weapons against them in a first strike, right? So Reagan thought that notion was totally absurd, because he knew we have no desire as the US to have a first strike against the Soviet Union. But what he didn't appreciate was that the Soviet Union didn't have that same understanding, because to yourself, you're peaceful. You're like, I'm a peaceful person. I'm defensive in nature. But the other side doesn't see you that same way. So
Mm.
if you're in a situation where all this rhetoric is going back and forth and everybody's being very difficult with one another publicly, it can be very, very easy to fall into that way of thinking of, yep, they're the problem. I'm not the problem. They know very well that we would never use nuclear weapons. They're just being like this for some reason. I don't know why. And that's where the personal contact becomes very, sort of important, because what Reagan was able to understand from Gorbachev was, actually, Gorbachev doesn't have that same understanding, and I need to convince him. I need to convince him that we're basically on the same page here. I need to convince him that we're defensive and we're not going to use nuclear weapons against him. And you can't really do that in a letter or a text or a cable wire. You have to be in the room with one another to be convincing, to be persuasive about that.
Very interesting. I attended several workshops of Carl Rogers,
Mm.
and I remember he said several times that I like to bring together leaders of Soviet Union and America at that time and other leaders, and to do some psychological workshops. And he was very optimistic on changing politics through
Mhm.
these kinds of interpersonal encounter groups. But a lot of people had a very big skepticism on such an idea. In
Mhm.
fact, he tried to do some big workshops, brought some politicians, but he didn't have much time to do. He died in few years. But coming back to this idea, bringing politicians, big politicians together and doing some kinds of psychological workshop, do you think it would help to overcome political differences and resolving some international conflicts? Or it is a very naive thing
Right.
to...
No, I actually think they are important. I mean, the research suggests that if you can get people in a room together and you can develop these sort of, active listening protocols, the empathy sort of principles, and get people to really sit down and listen and try to understand the other side, that does have a meaningful impact and change, right? So there's a bunch of studies in the sort of contact hypothesis literature that talks about how just taking the perspective of somebody else for a few minutes can change the way that you understand what their problems are. It can lowers levels of prejudice. It makes you kind of better equipped to understand what they're going through, and that has an effect that will last over time. So I think it's incredibly valuable. I think the tricky part And there are workshops, by the way, that have been very successful. So India Pakistan workshops, for example, have done some of this, and have been successful. Not necessarily resolving entire crises, but sort of making incremental building blocks towards better
Also, Herbert
relationships.
Kellman's workshops.
Exactly, right. And the problem is, I think a couple of things. One is oftentimes the people and the individuals that you would want to participate aren't interested in participating, right? So if you would imagine, like, really, if we were to do this, you would want to get heads of state in a room together and try to do this, right? The prospect of getting Putin and Xi and Biden or Trump and
Right.
to come together is very, very low, right? So then it's like, okay, well, what's the second level? Can we get defense ministers? Can we get foreign ministry officials to do it? And you can sometimes get that level, but even there it's very tricky. I mean, I think China, for example, I think would be very skeptical of an attempt, especially driven by the United States or the West, for doing a type of workshop like this, because they might ask themselves, well, what's in it for the United States? What are they getting out of this? Why do they want us to participate? They oftentimes, I think, will see the United States as the problem and say, like, no, like, we should be hosting the workshop, you should come to us. That type of thing becomes a problem. So you often end up sort of resorting to either lower levels of officials or kind of retired military or diplomats who don't have active sort of say about what's going on, but at least can give you the context, right? And
Yeah.
I think that's valuable, right? I think it's very difficult to draw a distinct kind of causal arrow from, we held this workshop in Abu Dhabi in 2017, and now we have an outcome down the
Mhm.
road that we can point to, right? So
Mhm.
so sort of showing the causality, I think, is always tricky. But my take on this is that, again, it's like a recurring theme of our discussion. More contact is better than less contact. While
Mhm.
difficult to measure, I think these interactions that happen at all different levels, from kids playing baseball to high level summitry, it all matters. I think the challenge is just showing exactly how it matters. And then also I would say too, doing making sure you're not doing things to make things worse. Sometimes these workshops can kind of backfire, because if you have people in the room who have these long-standing levels of hostility, you might not ever be able to get over that initial kind of level of hostility, right? So it's you have to be very careful in the way that you do it. And I know that there's a large literature on these types of workshops, that there are best practices for how to minimize the risks. But I do want people to realize that it's not necessarily a risk-free endeavor, because you can often sort of exacerbate things if you're not careful. But overall, I would say I'm a big fan of it. I think any kind of confidence building measures between countries that are in a sort of poor relationship of distrust or mistrust, I think is incredibly valuable.
Yeah. Well, I certainly and strongly believe that diplomats should contact even with work, interact with enemies, not just with friends.
Right.
It's their job. But on the other hand, they depend so much on politicians. So diplomats are very much have limitations to contact and to interact and set up human relations because, again, political some instructions, political forces, political pressure. That's a limitation
Mhm.
depending on politics. So I would be very happy to free diplomacy from politics. It a little bit more independent from politics. But
I
anyway,
totally agree.
yeah. One or two words about emotions.
Hmm.
Of course, we know that emotions are now a very important subject in international relations theory, in diplomacy, which was not the case a few years ago, 15, 20 years ago. You wouldn't find any word emotion in textbooks.
Right.
So on international relations and etc. But again, should we attach emotions just to individuals?
Mhm.
Or could we speak about emotions of states if we consider state as people or as persons? So, how can we meaningfully discuss emotions in the context of states, interstate relations, and diplomacy? So, how's your approach to emotions in this context?
Right. No, that's a great Great several questions, actually. I mean, I tend to study emotions at the individual level, but I do recognize that I think group emotion and state emotions exist. So,
Mm,
if you think about how the United States felt on September 11th, for example.
mm,
This
mm.
heinous terrorist attack.
Right.
I adopt the idea that we collectively in the U.S. felt something that day.
Mm,
It was
mm,
fear, it was anger. It was a lot of different emotions, but it was collectively felt. It wasn't just the fact that I, as an individual, was experiencing something, and that this person over here was also experiencing that same thing. There was something more about it that was collective in nature. I think methodologically, it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what that is. When do you have a collective emotion versus when don't you? Like, this becomes very tricky to solve kind of scientifically. But I definitely think that emotions are collective and shared. And actually, some of the work from sociology kind of reinforces this point that emotions. Like, if you think about the context of a soccer match or a football game or something like that, when your team wins, they score a touchdown or they score a goal, there's a collective emotion, and there's a sort of
mm,
exuberance and there's an energy that gets created, right? But the bigger point for me is that emotion, previously, in international relations, was always sort of tied to irrationality, or it was tied to sort of bad outcomes. To say somebody was emotional, they made an emotional decision, meant that they did something rash, they weren't
Very true.
thinking. Right.
Yeah.
We now know that that's wrong, right? That actually, emotion is tied to cognition, and emotion is tied to rationality. Actually,
Mm,
people who suffer brain trauma and lose parts of the brain that are responsible for emotion have a strong difficulty making rational decisions, and it's
mm,
because the parts of your brain that are using emotion or responsible for emotion are also tied to rational decision making. So we sort of overcome that problem. And I think the other thing that we've started to realize is that sometimes emotions can be very productive. So if we're in a meeting together face to face, let's say my sharing of an emotion with you, if we have the same mood, we have the same sort of emotion, that can be
mm,
productive because we see in each other that we're feeling the same way, and we can start to
mm,
build a bond based on that. But it can also be productive if we share something that we want to avoid. So, for example, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is one of the things that Nick Wheeler and I write about in one of our forthcoming chapters. Actually, it was actually fear, this
mm.
very strong fear that both Kennedy and Khrushchev
Yeah.
felt,
Yeah.
that wanted them to resolve this peacefully, right? We think of fear, it's like, oh, that's going to lead to irrationality, that's going to lead to making rash decisions,
Yeah.
making quick
Very
decisions.
interesting. Very
it
interesting.
actually it actually led to them being more careful and recognizing we need to find a rational solution to this, one that works for both of us. And I think it was the fear that kind of, it's basically the fear the world would end, nuclear annihilation, that pushed them to that. And so Sergei Plokhy, the historian, has this wonderful line. I can't remember if it's in a book, or maybe I heard it on a YouTube video or something. He said that nuclear weapons during the Cuban Missile Crisis both created the crisis but also resolved the crisis. So it created the crisis because it created this fear of what was going to happen. But because neither side wanted that to happen, it actually resolved the crisis too, because they feared it so badly that they found a way out. So in general, I'm a big fan of thinking about emotions in international politics, both sort of at the individual and collective level. I think it's easier to study and get traction at individual levels of analysis, but I'm a proponent of thinking that shared emotion and collective emotion is a real thing, and we shouldn't take it for granted. And frankly, there are probably really good books and dissertations to be written looking at this in international politics and diplomacy, and trying to get at that methodological problem of how do you know you have a collective emotion and when you don't.
Yeah. It's a great idea that, of course, emotions could play a very constructive role as well
Hmm.
in international politics, not just destructive, but very constructive. That's a very
Exactly.
And just one or two words about mirror neurons. So I know you wrote again many things about that. So could you just say a few words how these mirror neurons influence negotiations?
Sure.
And if we see clear evidence that it has an effect on negotiations, how this could be used in diplomacy more strategically.
Right.
So Uh,
Well, I mean, I could talk about this for several hours, but I'll try to be very brief. So
yeah,
the idea of the mirror neurons is that there was a discovery in first in monkeys that basically to make it sort of easy to understand, these neurons were firing when a monkey was doing an action or seeing an action, right? So if you reach out to grab a banana, then what was happening is that the monkey was seeing you reach out to grab the banana, and the same neurons that would fire if it itself was reaching out to grab the banana were was grabbing it. And so for a while, neuroscientists didn't really understand what was going on with these things, but it turns out that it's one of the mechanisms that we use to make sense of intentional action and
mm,
make sense of what's going on
right.
with another being, right? So monkey to monkey or human to human. So in the
Mm,
human case, though, it's much more linked to sort of understanding action behavior. So like the actions of an individual when they're having a mannerism or they're smiling or there's a twitch on the face or whatever. All of these different things are understood at the neural level because you're simulating in your own brain what's going on. So that's the basic idea. So in diplomacy and face-to-face interactions, when you have that ability to see the other side, you're very much in a sort of situation where both brains, and this sounds kind of strange, but both brains are doing the same thing at once, which makes a connection between the two and sort of supports the idea that people talk about like we're on the same wavelength, right? Well, there's some evidence to suggest at the brain level that's actually happening to a certain extent. So the way that I study or I bring in the mirror neuron literature into my own work is I don't put people into an fMRI machine and have them conduct negotiations, although I think that would be interesting. But rather, I take inspiration from that literature and I ask, if this is true, what should we expect to see in face-to-face interactions, right? So we would expect, given the literature, specific intentions, because that's what they're firing, most on when they're seeing a specific intentional act, should be the thing that is clarified in face-to-face interaction. So I look at it sort of as a theory building kind of way. And maybe one day I will put people into the fMRI machines or whatever.
yeah,
But
you
but
have a lab.
yeah, we have a lab. We don't have the machine yet, but like, what I could do that. But I think the important part is that when policymakers understand this, what they should note is the all of the things that you're getting on the interpersonal side, all of that information is important and should be taken seriously, right? So, for example, I've spoken with some diplomats who understand this kind of intuitively, and in their notes after every meeting that they have with somebody, they'll write down their impressions based on facial expressions, based on mannerisms, based on the energy, based on anything that caught their attention, because it's just another piece of data, it sort of helps to kind of flesh out what might be happening internally with them. So you're kind of matching up what's being said with all of the other information you're getting through the mirror neurons or through other ways to sort of appreciate where they're coming from. So if I just summarize just in kind of one sentence, I think what the mirror neurons do
Yeah.
is they provide humanization because fundamentally they're connecting two people at the brain level, connected, like a literal connection, where what's happening in your brain is happening in mine, and that provides a way for us to connect that is unavailable to us through other types of interaction.
So, what would be your advice to some top diplomats, decision makers, in using these insights in diplomacy more strategically?
I would say two things. First of all, write down everything. So your immediate first impressions should be like written down. And when somebody is talking specifically about what their interests are or what their intentions are, try to understand at that physical level what changes, if any, have occurred. Right. And we all know this sort of intuitively. Sometimes people, when they're making a particular point, something will change about them. Maybe it's the
Mm,
timbre of their voice. Maybe they look to the side. Maybe they stop looking you in the eye. Like all this type of stuff, I think is relevant. But mostly, pay attention to the levels of energy that you see, the emotions that you're seeing, all that type of stuff. And then the second thing is to recognize that what face-to-face diplomacy allows for you in terms of reading other people, it allows
mm,
for the other side as well for you to be read. And sometimes that's what you want. Sometimes you want to sort of convey to the other side your sincerity. Sometimes you want to convey reassurance. Sometimes you want to convey exactly what's on your mind, and you're trying to convince somebody that this is what I believe. This is what I'm going to do. I'm trying to convince you of that. But sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you want to say, I don't want the other side to really know a whole lot about how I feel about this. And maybe in those instances, that's where you opt for a phone call, or that's where you opt for an email, or maybe even Zoom a little bit, right? Because you don't want to be read. You want to be able to say something and have the other side kind of guessing how you really feel about it, right? So my advice is to think about face-to-face diplomacy strategically. And if the things that I'm talking about are right, that you're able to get these cues and these sort of simulations and notes about the other side through all these behaviors, that goes both ways, and you have to recognize that, and you're giving off those same cues to other people when you're interacting with them.
Yeah, very interesting. Usually junior diplomats take notes.
Hmm.
Perhaps one of the advice might be to advise a senior diplomats also do something, right
That's
yourself.
interesting. Yeah. I think sometimes it's more senior diplomats feel they probably don't need to.
Right.
But oftentimes I think it's beneficial. And there's variation in this. I mean, everybody's different. Some people like to take notes, some people don't. But as a
Yeah.
general rule, at least just kind of jotting down, I think sometimes people will jot down the information that's transmitted. This is what this person thinks about X, and this is what they're saying about Y. Couple that with your personal impressions as well, and then later when you go back, you can say, well, now I think about it, this person was a little bit sort of more energetic when they were talking about X, or this person seemed a little bit sort of fishy when they were talking about Y, right? It's easy to kind of forget that information, but it might be relevant to you, a week later, a year later, whatever, to have that written down.
Yeah. When we discuss psychology, diplomacy, political psychology, perhaps it would be logical to come to the role of intuition
Mm.
and gut feelings. What kinds of role they may play in diplomacy?
Yeah, I mean, I write about this a lot actually because I think it's underappreciated in international relations and political science. We think about gut feelings, we think about intuitions as sort of negative. Like you don't want to go on your gut. You want to be systematic and you want to think about everything, right? But it's often actually, if you look historically, the gut intuition and the gut reaction that actually oftentimes saves things, right? So, for example, again, going back to the Cold War, Reagan had this kind of gut instinct or intuition. I need to go sit down with Gorbachev. And the reason I need to do that is because he clearly doesn't understand me. So his intuition, I think, was right. Let me go explain myself in person. I can't do it over the phone. I have to be in person. So that instinct was really important. The other instinct that Gorbachev got from Reagan, which was important, was he saw in Reagan somebody who he might disagree with, he might have philosophical differences with, but he saw that he's somebody that he could trust. But more specifically, like he was somebody who meant what he said. Right. And that was his gut instinct and that was his intuition. And that was very productive because now he had this human note about the other side. Like, I have a hunch that this person is telling me the truth and I can work with this person. Right. Again, I'm not sure you're going to be able to get that through a letter or even maybe a phone call, right? It's the seeing of the other person that gives you that intuition. But the crucial thing is, I don't think you can stop there, right? So if you have a belief, or excuse me, you have an intuition about the other side, you have to convert that to what I talk about as beliefs, which is
Mhm.
it's reflective, it's backed up by other things. So Gorbachev just saying like, okay, Reagan, I think is somebody who says what he means in that moment, that's fine. But you need to reflect on that after the meeting is over and think about why you had that intuition in the first place and fundamentally move that intuition into something that's a well-formed belief in your own kind of mental system, right? And once you have that belief, it becomes much stronger, and you can back that belief up with other data, and you can see how other information. So this is also, so one of the other reasons why note taking I think is important. It's like you want to reflect on why did I have that intuition in the first place? I was speaking with you and you said something and I was like, my intuition is that he's telling me the truth. Why? What was it? And I was like, oh right, in my notes I had he got excited, energetic when he said that or something, something like that, or he shook my hand and he seemed to mean it, very sincerely. So that's an intuition. Now I take that and I think about the interaction that we had, and I think about other things that are going on, other data, and try to move that intuition into a belief. And then once it's a belief, it's much stronger. So I think gut reactions and instincts are really important. Intuitions are important. Um, it's just a matter of kind of making sure that that intuition is correct and well founded, and that requires coupling it, with your own personal impressions with other data that's available to you.
Yeah, very interesting. With all this new knowledge about the human side of diplomacy, so emotions, do you think we should rethink, have a new approach to diplomatic training
Hmm.
by bringing some more psychological stuff in training diplomats? For example, pay special attention to empathy. What you're thinking about bringing all these political psychology insights into diplomatic trainings?
100%, yeah. And this is actually one of the things that Nick and I in our book, in the conclusion, basically argue, right? That our research suggests that the role of empathy, the role of listening,
Mhm.
the role of taking the perspective of the other side, having a sensibility that you might be kind of part of the other person's insecurity, all of this stuff is important, and a lot of it doesn't come naturally. I think actually a lot of it, what comes naturally, goes in the other direction, right? Because for the reasons we talked about, I think that I'm peaceful, so if we're in a situation of conflict, the other side must be the problem, right? Because I'm peaceful. I don't. And so just sort of taking a moment to kind of work through perspective taking and understanding how a given action might be perceived by the other side is very valuable. I see this oftentimes in my students and my undergraduates. They have good ideas about, if you want to reduce the mistrust between the United States and China, they have good ideas about sort of what actions the United States should take from the US's perspective. But it's much
Mhm.
harder to get them to think about how China is likely to see those same actions, right? And interpret, those actions not necessarily in a favorable light, but in a very sort of aggressive way. So an action that to us as Americans might seem not aggressive at all can be very much perceived as an aggressive one by somebody who doesn't share our own sensibilities, right? So I think all of that sort of understanding could be used in training programs. And I know that sometimes, like at the State Department, they do have a certain level of psychology built into foreign service officer training and things like that. But it just strikes me that the more is better.
Mhm.
And we could be doing more, I think, to bring in the insights from all of this literature that we've been talking about over the last hour or so and make it applicable and accessible to diplomats who are in training, and then even ones that are more seasoned. Not a bad idea to have a lecture every once in a while at an embassy or State Department on some of these principles, just to kind of reinforce some of the ideas.
Yeah. What do you think about the psychobiography? Do you think it's a good idea to do more psychobiography of diplomats? Would it be valuable to
Yeah,
that?
I actually have a very early project looking at psychobiographies, because I think a lot of the sort of baby was thrown out with the bathwater when these things sort of were discredited. Like everybody looking at psychobiographies back in the old days said they're too Freudian, and you're making too many leaps from this thing happened in childhood to now this is the person that they are. So I think if done poorly, you're in this situation where you're kind of making causal claims that maybe aren't warranted. So I don't think you should do that. But I do believe, I think strongly, that experiences that people have, whether in childhood, early adulthood, we know, for example, some, have written about military experience has a particular, set of effects. So I'm a firm believer that it's possible that early experiences do form, in some people, a better opportunity to or capacity to empathize, better sort of capacity to have perspective taking and things like that. It's just challenging to know with any degree of certainty, methodologically, why you could have two people, one of whom has an experience and goes this direction, one person has a very similar experience and goes this direction from that experience. Why is that variation occurring? I think that's kind of hard to get at. But in general, I'm a big fan of this, and I think we're going to see more and more use of psychobiographies going forward. Less about, again, that sort of moment causes them to be X, but rather, can we paint a portrait of somebody who, through a variety of experiences, might have a particular way of understanding the world or a schema, a set of like ways of thinking about the world, and this other person who had different experiences has a different schema. I think we can get to that level.
Many think what you are doing, as I see, it's in fact bringing individual into politics or diplomacy. So individual diplomats, their relations, human relations, that's very important, very valuable. But at the same time, we understand that there are big political interests.
Mhm.
So how the role of individual might be in the context of intercourse of political interests. For example, to be even more concrete, on the one hand, we may have very good diplomat as an individual, very skillful, from a very developing country or small country. But on the other hand, a nice, a good diplomat, maybe not very skillful, but nevertheless a good diplomat from a very powerful country.
Hmm.
So, do you think individual qualities make a difference? Or, after all, everything depends on your political.
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is always the challenge. It's been the challenge of doing individual level work since the beginning of international relations. I think it's fair to say. And that challenge is individuals are always operating under a broader structure of the
Right.
situation. You think about it very just simply, the structure of the world, the structure of the situation is going to have effects, right? And so if you are representing the United States, you're in a very different situation than if you're representing St. Kitts, in a negotiation or something like that, right? You could be the most powerful diplomat in the world, but you're never going to be able to materially change the structure because the United States has more power and this and that, right?
Right.
So I think it's less about. I don't think about it in terms of like what matters more. I think about it in terms of one, what are the ways in which individuals can affect structure? So if we think about it, leaders, for example, I would argue that leaders actually do have the capacity to change the structure of the system and change our understanding of how the system works. So you can do it from time to time, and there are important cases in history where that's been the case. But more often, the way that the structure is changed is not through these sort of like zeitgeist, big changes, but rather just incrementally through quotidian day-to-day, interactions, right? So the structure of the system in some ways is always changing, and it's always changing because you have diplomats interacting at the United Nations or at NATO or at the World Trade Organization, right? And so you can't see it in any given instance and say like, oh, today John changed the structure of this the system, but he is or she is able to change it incrementally through the work that they do. But in general, the tricky part with doing this work is that structure is always there. And it's hard sometimes to be clear on how much work the structure is doing and how much work the actual individuals are doing. And so I don't think that international relations has solved this problem. I mean, it goes back to the beginning of time. I'm not sure it's a solvable problem. Like I don't
Agency structure problem.
Agent
Yeah.
structure problem. Yeah, exactly. It might be a problem that's not solvable. I mean, and in some ways you could say, well, yeah, of course, structures and agents are mutually reinforcing and they affect one another. And that's the argument that I just made. But you might say, well, that doesn't resolve anything. You're just sort of saying, that there are these kind of relationships that are constitutive of one another. But at the moment, I feel like that's kind of the best that we can do. The one way forward might be experimentally, where you have not in the real world necessarily, but subjects and experiments conduct negotiations under sort of manipulated structural
Mm.
constraints and see, are there any
Yeah.
instances where the individuals can actually change the thing. So I think it's possible.
That's a
um
good idea.
yeah, but that's a hard problem to solve. That's I can't solve that one.
Okay, so my last question about the main problem or problems of political psychology in the study of diplomacy. What
Hmm.
do you, what's the main or challenge or problem?
I mean, I think it's one that we've hinted at pretty much our entire conversation today, which is getting from individual brains and individual minds and individuals working with one another to something that we call the state is just
Mm,
very difficult, right? So it's not obvious that you have a situation where even when leaders get along and they trust one another, that can create a sense in which both the states that are involved in that in the interaction now suddenly get along as well, right? So we need a way to go from individual leaders interacting to the state level. So people talk about this as a so-called aggregation problem. Nick and I in our book, we have an attempt to do this, as I was alluding to before. I don't think we're able to solve the problem necessarily, but I think it's probably the core issue of bringing in psychology is how you get from the individual level to the state level. Like, how do you
right.
bridge that gap? Um, that's a challenge. And so, if anybody out there is listening and has ideas, let me know, because I think this is one that where we need a lot of creativity and thoughts.
Right. I'd like to thank you for your time, for your insight. It's wonderful to have such a enlightening discussion.
Of
Thank you so
course. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I will say, if you are a diplomacy skeptic, so I have one of my co-authors and colleagues, Jeff Kaplow here at William and Mary. He's a diplomacy skeptic, and so
much.
what we did is we created a podcast. It's called Cheap Talk,
Mm.
and it's on Spotify. So if you're interested in having hear me debate somebody who doesn't like diplomacy or doesn't think it matters all that much, tune into Cheap Talk and you can listen to us kind of go at it because he's got very different views.
Well, one may not like diplomacy, but in fact, it is one of the oldest and one of the very essential, not just profession, but activity of human being. When you're
Exactly.
living in a society, you have to have some sort of diplomacy in order to deal with others. So,
Totally
someone
agree.
could enjoy, someone could like it, but it's very important.
Yep, totally agree.
Thank you so much
Thank
again.
you so much. Appreciate it.